The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle, as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly toward the main entrance. Unlike other days when he would rush excitedly to his lessons or outdoor activities, today his steps were slow and thoughtful. He had been awake since dawn, thinking about something that had been bothering him for weeks. Standing near the grand stone pillars were 4 members of the Royal Guard, their red uniforms pristine and their tall black hats perfectly positioned. These weren't just any guards. They were men who had protected his family for years. George knew their faces well, even though they rarely spoke while on duty. There was Thomas, who had a kind smile hidden beneath his serious expression. Next to him stood Marcus, whose eyes always seemed to twinkle when George walked by. Then there was David, who had once quietly helped George pick up his scattered books when he had tripped on the castle steps. Finally, there was Samuel, the youngest of the group, who had joined the guard just 2 years ago. What troubled Prince George was something he had overheard during a conversation between his parents 3 nights earlier. They had been discussing the upcoming state visit, and his father had mentioned concerns about the guards working excessive hours without proper rest. The young prince had learned that these dedicated men often worked 16-hour shifts, standing motionless for hours at a time, protecting the royal family without complaint. As George approached the guards, he noticed how David's hand trembled slightly. The man had been standing at his post since 4 in the morning, and it was now nearly noon. Thomas's face looked pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes that his hat couldn't hide. Marcus kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, a subtle sign that his legs were aching from hours of standing. Samuel, despite being the youngest, looked exhausted, his usual bright demeanor dimmed by fatigue. The young prince stopped a few feet away from the guards, his heart racing with nervousness. He had never done anything like what he was planning to do. Royal protocol was strict, and children of the royal family were taught from an early age about proper behavior and respect for traditions. But George felt something stirring inside him, a feeling that some things were more important than rules and traditions. He thought about his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, who had always taught him that true leadership meant caring for those who serve you. She had often spoken about the importance of compassion and understanding the struggles of others. His mother, Catherine, had shown him through her charity work that helping others wasn't just about grand gestures, but also about noticing the small ways people suffered and finding ways to ease their burden. Prince George took a deep breath and stepped closer to the guards. They remained perfectly still, staring straight ahead as their training demanded, but George could see the surprise in their eyes as he approached. It was unusual for any member of the royal family to break protocol in such a direct way, especially a child. The castle courtyard was busy with staff members hurrying about their duties, tourists taking photographs from a distance, and other officials conducting their daily business. But in that moment, it felt to George like he and the 4 guards were the only people in the world. He could hear his own heartbeat and feel the weight of what he was about to do. Looking up at Thomas, whose face remained professionally neutral despite his obvious fatigue, George spoke in a clear, gentle voice that carried the confidence of his royal upbringing, but also the sincere concern of a caring child. His words would soon change everything for these 4 dedicated men, and the ripple effects of his actions would spread far beyond the castle walls. The young prince understood that what he was about to do might be questioned by some, praised by others, and remembered for years to come. But in his heart, he knew it was the right thing to do. Sometimes the most powerful acts of leadership come not from commanding others, but from showing them kindness when they least expect it and most need it. "Excuse me," Prince George said softly, his voice carrying just enough authority to command attention while remaining respectful. The 4 guards' eyes flickered toward him, though they maintained their rigid postures. "I know you're not supposed to move or speak while on duty, but I need to tell you something important." Thomas, the senior guard, felt his throat tighten with emotion. In his 12 years of service, no member of the royal family had ever addressed him so directly during his watch. The other guards shared his surprise, their training warring with their curiosity about what the young prince wanted to say. George continued, his words carefully chosen but spoken from the heart. "I've been watching you all work for many months now. I see how long you stand here, how tired you get, and how you never complain even when it's raining or freezing cold. I know you do this to keep my family safe, and I want you to know that I notice and I'm grateful." The prince paused, gathering courage for what he would say next. Around them, the normal bustle of castle life continued, but several staff members had begun to take notice of the unusual scene unfolding near the main entrance. A few tourists with cameras had also spotted the interaction, though they were too far away to hear the conversation. "I've learned that you've been working extra hours because there aren't enough guards scheduled for this week," George continued. "I also know that you haven't had proper breaks or time to rest. That's not fair, and it's not right." His voice grew stronger as he spoke, the conviction of his beliefs giving him confidence. "I've spoken with my father, and we both agree that this needs to change." Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes, though his training prevented him from showing any visible emotion. He had been struggling financially and had volunteered for extra shifts to support his young daughter, but the exhaustion was taking its toll on his health. He had never expected that anyone in the royal family would notice or care about the personal sacrifices he and his colleagues made. David, whose wife had been worried about his increasing fatigue and the stress it was placing on their marriage, felt a warmth spread through his chest. For weeks he had been considering requesting a transfer to a less demanding position, but the young prince's words reminded him why he had chosen this career in the first place: to serve something greater than himself. Samuel, the youngest guard, was amazed by the maturity and compassion in Prince George's voice. He had always admired the royal family from a distance, but this personal interaction revealed a level of humanity that he had only hoped existed behind the formal protocols and public appearances. Prince George took another step closer, his next words carrying even more weight. "Starting tomorrow, there will be additional guards assigned to this post so that each of you can have proper rest periods. You'll also receive a week of paid leave to spend with your families and recover from these difficult weeks of extra duty." The announcement sent a wave of disbelief through the four men. Paid leave was a rare privilege, and the promise of additional staffing meant that their grueling schedules would finally become manageable. But what struck them most was not the practical benefits of what the prince was offering, but the fact that he had taken the time to notice their struggles and had cared enough to take action. "But that's not all," George continued, his voice growing even more gentle. "I want each of you to know that your service means everything to my family. You're not just guards standing at a post. You're the reason we can sleep safely at night, the reason we can move freely around our home, and the reason we can focus on serving the British people without fear." The emotional impact of these words was immediate and profound. Thomas felt his rigid posture soften slightly, and Marcus had to blink rapidly to clear his vision. David felt a renewed sense of pride in his work, and Samuel realized that his decision to join the Royal Guard had been validated in a way he had never imagined possible. The young prince's gesture was creating ripples that extended far beyond the four men standing before him. Other guards throughout the castle were beginning to hear about what was happening, and the news was spreading among the staff with remarkable speed. As Prince George finished speaking, something extraordinary began to happen. Thomas, the senior guard who had served the royal family for over a decade, felt his eyes filling with tears that he could no longer hold back. The strict training that had taught him to remain motionless and emotionless was overwhelmed by the genuine kindness he had just witnessed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Thomas's rigid posture began to relax. His shoulders, which had been pulled back in perfect military alignment for hours, began to drop. His hands, which had been clenched tightly at his sides, gradually opened. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to anyone watching closely. Marcus noticed the change in his colleague and felt his own composure beginning to crack. The emotional wall that separated his professional duties from his personal feelings started to crumble. He thought about his 6-year-old daughter, Emma, who had been asking why Daddy was always so tired and couldn't play with her as much as before. The prince's words had given him hope that he might soon have the energy to be the father Emma deserved. David, whose marriage had been strained by his demanding schedule, felt a weight lifting from his chest. His wife, Sarah, had been understanding about his long hours, but he could see the loneliness in her eyes when he came home exhausted night after night. The promise of proper rest and additional support meant that he might finally be able to balance his duty to the crown with his love for his family. Samuel, the youngest of the group, was struggling with emotions he had never experienced while on duty. The prince's recognition of their service had touched something deep inside him, reminding him of why he had chosen this path despite offers of higher-paying jobs in private security. Prince George watched as the four men before him began to show their humanity. He realized that his words had created something beautiful, a moment where the barriers between royalty and those who serve them had dissolved, replaced by simple human connection and mutual respect. "Your Highness," Thomas said quietly, his voice thick with emotion as he broke protocol for the first time in his career. "Thank you for seeing us not just as guards, but as people." The words came out in a whisper, but they carried the weight of years of dedicated service and personal sacrifice. Other guards who had been positioned around the castle began to notice the unusual scene. Word spread quickly through their communication network that something significant was happening at the main entrance. Within minutes, guards from other posts began to find reasons to walk past the area, drawn by curiosity and a growing sense that they were witnessing something historic. Margaret, the head of castle housekeeping staff, was walking by when she noticed the emotional exchange. She had worked at the castle for 25 years and had never seen anything like it. The sight of the guards showing visible emotion while the young prince stood before them with such compassion made her stop in her tracks. The tourists and photographers who had been taking pictures from a distance began to sense that something special was happening. Though they couldn't hear the conversation, they could see the body language of the guards changing, becoming less rigid and more human. Cameras began clicking more frequently as people tried to capture what they instinctively knew was a meaningful moment. Prince George noticed the attention they were attracting, but he didn't feel embarrassed or concerned about protocol. Instead, he felt proud that others were witnessing this display of genuine human emotion and connection. He had learned from his parents that true leadership sometimes meant being vulnerable and showing others that compassion was not a weakness, but a strength. "I have one more thing to ask of you," the prince said, his voice carrying a new note of confidence. "When you do take your leave time, I want you to promise me that you'll truly rest. Don't think about work. Don't worry about the castle. Just focus on your families, your hobbies, and the things that make you happy outside of these walls." The four guards looked at each other, and for the first time while on duty, they shared genuine smiles. The emotional barriers that had kept them isolated in their roles were dissolving, replaced by a sense of camaraderie and shared appreciation for what they had just experienced. What none of them knew was that Prince George's gesture was about to have consequences that would reach far beyond the castle grounds, touching the lives of people they had never met and inspiring changes that would be felt for years to come. The emotional breakthrough that had begun with the four guards started to spread throughout Windsor Castle like ripples in a calm pond. Within an hour of Prince George's conversation, guards at every post were talking about what had happened. The story was shared in whispered conversations during brief moments when protocols allowed, and with each telling, the impact grew stronger. James, a guard stationed at the East Wing, heard about the incident from Marcus during a brief shift change. As Marcus described the young prince's words and the way they had all been moved to tears, James felt his own eyes growing moist. He had been struggling with similar exhaustion and had been considering leaving the Royal Guard despite his love for the work. "He really said that our service meant everything to his family?" James asked, his voice filled with wonder. Marcus nodded, unable to speak as he remembered the sincerity in the prince's eyes. This simple confirmation gave James a renewed sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in months. Meanwhile, news of the prince's gesture had reached other areas of the castle staff. Elizabeth, a young maid who had often seen the guards looking tired and stressed, felt tears of joy when she heard what had happened. She had always wanted to say something supportive to them but had been too shy and uncertain about protocol to speak up. Cook Robert, who had been preparing meals for the castle staff for 15 years, immediately began planning special meals for the guards. He had noticed that they often skipped breaks and rarely had time for proper nutrition during their long shifts. The prince's kindness inspired him to find his own way to show care for these dedicated men. Dr. Helen Morrison, the castle's medical officer, heard about the incident from Margaret, the head housekeeper. She had been concerned for weeks about the physical toll that extended shifts were taking on the guards, but had felt constrained by the hierarchical nature of the castle's operations. The prince's actions gave her courage to formally recommend health and wellness programs for all castle security staff. Outside the castle walls, The impact was beginning to spread even further. Sarah, David's wife, received a phone call from her husband during his break, something that rarely happened during his shifts. His voice was different, lighter, more hopeful, as he told her about the prince's words and promises. "He saw us, Sarah," David said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Really saw us as people, not just uniforms standing at posts." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to her husband describe how a 10-year-old boy had recognized their sacrifices and taken action to help them. Emma, Marcus's 6-year-old daughter, didn't fully understand when her father called to tell her that he would soon have more time to spend with her. But she could hear the happiness in his voice, and she began jumping up and down with excitement at the prospect of having more playtime with her daddy. The story was also beginning to reach other royal guards stationed at different locations. Palace security operates as a close-knit community, and news travels quickly through their networks. Guards at Buckingham Palace, Kensington Palace, and other royal residences started hearing about what Prince George had done. Captain Williams, the head of royal security, received a detailed report about the incident within 2 hours of it happening. Rather than being concerned about protocol violations, he found himself deeply moved by the account. He had served the royal family for 20 years and had always admired their character. But this display of compassion from someone so young reinforced his belief in the institution he protected. "This is what true leadership looks like," he told his deputy, Commander Thompson. The prince didn't just notice a problem. He cared enough to take action and showed genuine appreciation for those who serve. That's the mark of someone who will one day be a great king. Social media began to buzz with activity as some of the tourists who had witnessed the scene started sharing photos and videos. Though they hadn't been close enough to hear the conversation, the images clearly showed the emotional exchange between the young prince and the guards. The photos captured the moment when the guards' rigid postures had softened and their faces had shown genuine emotion. Local news stations started picking up the story, though the full details were still emerging. Royal correspondents began making phone calls to their contacts within the palace, trying to understand what had caused such visible emotion among the usually stoic royal guard. The ripple effects were spreading far beyond what anyone could have imagined, touching lives in ways both big and small. But perhaps the most significant impact was still to come, as word of the prince's gesture began to reach people who had never set foot in a royal residence, but who understood the universal power of recognition, kindness, and human compassion. By evening, the story of Prince George's compassionate gesture had spread far beyond the castle walls and was beginning to touch hearts across the United Kingdom. Social media platforms were filled with photos from the morning's events, and the hashtag #PrinceGeorgeKindness was trending as people shared their own stories of appreciation for public servants who often go unrecognized. At a police station in Manchester, Sergeant Helen Davies read about the incident during her break. She had been feeling underappreciated after weeks of long shifts dealing with difficult situations, and the story brought tears to her eyes. "If a 10-year-old prince can recognize service and sacrifice," she told her colleagues, "maybe there's hope that others will too." In Birmingham, firefighter Tom Patterson was scrolling through his phone when he came across the story. He had been considering leaving his job due to budget cuts and increased workloads, but reading about Prince George's words to the guards reminded him why he had chosen his profession. He screenshot the article and sent it to his wife with the message, "This is why I do what I do." The story reached the home of Mrs. Agnes Fletcher, an 82-year-old former royal staff member who had worked as a seamstress at the palace for 30 years before retiring. She sat in her small flat in London, reading the article on her tablet with tears streaming down her face. She remembered the young prince's father, William, as a child, and seeing the compassion being passed to the next generation filled her with pride and hope. Local newspapers across the country began picking up the story, each adding their own perspective on what the gesture meant for modern royalty and public service. The Yorkshire Post ran a feature about how the prince's actions reflected the values his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, had instilled in the family. The Scottish Herald focused on how the gesture demonstrated that the royal family understood the sacrifices made by those who served them. At the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, where future officers are trained, the story became a topic of discussion in leadership classes. Instructor Major Patricia Reynolds used the incident as an example of how true leadership often manifests in small, personal gestures rather than grand pronouncements. Prince George demonstrated something that many experienced leaders struggle with, she told her cadets. He saw beyond rank and protocol to recognize the human beings who serve him. That kind of awareness and compassion is what separates good leaders from great ones. The impact was also being felt in unexpected places. At a nursing home in Wales, care worker Jenny Morgan shared the story with her residents during their afternoon tea. Many of them had served in various capacities throughout their lives and felt moved by the recognition the young prince had given to service members. "It reminds me of when I was a young nurse during the war," said 94-year-old Dorothy Williams. "We rarely heard thank you, but when we did, it meant everything. Those boys standing guard needed to hear what the prince told them." Television news programs began featuring the story, with royal correspondents analyzing what the gesture revealed about the future of the monarchy. Royal historian Dr. Amanda Fitzpatrick appeared on BBC News, explaining how the incident fit into a tradition of royal compassion while also representing something new and personal. "What we're seeing with Prince George is a young person who has been raised to understand that privilege comes with responsibility," Dr. Fitzpatrick explained. "But more than that, he's showing an emotional intelligence and empathy that suggests he will connect with people in ways that are both traditional and refreshingly modern." International news outlets began picking up the story as well. CNN International ran a piece about how the gesture reflected changing attitudes toward mental health and worker welfare. The French newspaper Le Figaro published an editorial praising the prince's maturity and suggesting that his actions represented hope for the future of European monarchies. Back at Windsor Castle, the four guards who had been directly affected by the prince's kindness were trying to process the attention their story was receiving. Thomas received dozens of messages from fellow service members around the world, all expressing support and sharing their own experiences of feeling unseen in their roles. Marcus found himself becoming emotional again as he read comments from other parents who understood the challenge of balancing demanding jobs with family responsibilities. Many shared how they too had struggled with fatigue and the guilt of not being fully present for their children. David was amazed by the messages from military spouses who thanked him for his service and shared their own stories of managing relationships while dealing with the demands of service life. The sense of community and understanding was overwhelming and healing. Samuel, despite being the youngest, found himself fielding interview requests from journalists who wanted to hear his first-hand account of what had happened. Though he declined most interviews out of respect for royal privacy, he was moved by the outpouring of support from young people who saw him as an inspiration for choosing service over more lucrative careers. The story was creating conversations in homes, schools, and workplaces across the country about the importance of recognizing and appreciating those who serve others. But the most profound impact was still to come, as people began to reflect on how they could apply the prince's example of kindness and recognition in their own lives. 3 days after Prince George's heartfelt gesture, the ripple effects had grown into waves of positive change that surprised everyone involved. What had started as a simple act of kindness had become a catalyst for transformation that reached far beyond the royal family or even the United Kingdom. At the castle, the promised changes were already being implemented. Additional guards had been brought in, creating a rotation system that allowed for proper rest periods. The four guards who had been so moved by the prince's words were experiencing their first proper breaks in weeks, and the difference in their demeanor was remarkable. Thomas spent his first day off in months with his elderly mother, whom he had been too exhausted to visit regularly. As they sat in her garden sharing tea and conversation, she commented on how much more relaxed and happy he seemed. "You look like my son again," she said, "not just a tired man in uniform." Marcus took his daughter Emma to the park, something he hadn't had the energy to do in weeks. As he pushed her on the swings and listened to her delighted laughter, he felt tears of gratitude for the young prince who had made this moment possible. Emma noticed her father's tears and asked if he was sad. "No, sweetheart," Marcus said, hugging her tight. "I'm happier than I've been in a very long time." David and his wife Sarah had their first real date night in months. Over dinner at a quiet restaurant, they talked about their future with an optimism that had been missing from their relationship. Sarah noticed that the stress lines around her husband's eyes had already begun to soften, and his laugh sounded genuine again. Samuel used his time off to visit his parents in his hometown, bringing with him stories of the prince's kindness. His father, a former military man himself, was deeply moved by the account. "Son," he said, "you're serving under people who understand the value of service. That's a rare and precious thing." The positive changes weren't limited to the castle. Inspired by Prince George's example, people across the country began finding their own ways to recognize and appreciate those who serve them. Schools started programs where students could write thank you notes to local police officers, firefighters, and emergency medical workers. At St. Mary's Primary School in London, 8-year-old Sophie Williams organized her classmates to create handmade cards for the crossing guard, who helped them safely cross the street each day. When they presented the cards to Mr. Jenkins, the 65-year-old retired teacher who volunteered for the role, he was so moved he had to sit down for a moment to compose himself. Coffee shops began displaying signs thanking NHS workers, police officers, and other public servants. Many offered free drinks or discounts, but more importantly, they created spaces where these often overlooked individuals felt genuinely appreciated. The story had also reached the international community of royal protection officers. Security details from around the world shared the story, and many reported feeling renewed pride in their work. A protection officer for the Swedish royal family wrote on social media, "This young prince has reminded us all why we chose this path. We protect not just people, but values of service and compassion." Corporate leaders began taking notice as well. Several companies announced new employee wellness programs, citing Prince George's gesture as inspiration for better caring for their workforce. A major retail chain implemented mandatory break periods for security guards, directly referencing the royal story in their internal communications. Medical professionals were particularly moved by the story. Dr. Sarah Chen, who worked exhausting shifts at a London hospital, wrote in her blog, "When a 10-year-old prince can recognize exhaustion and take action to help, it makes me hope that our society is finally ready to have honest conversations about burnout and the human cost of essential services." The mental health implications of the story were also being discussed by professionals. Psychologist Dr. Michael Roberts appeared on several talk shows to discuss how recognition and appreciation can have profound effects on mental health and job satisfaction. What Prince George demonstrated, Dr. Roberts explained, is that sometimes the most powerful intervention for someone who is struggling is simply being seen and acknowledged. These guards weren't just tired, they were beginning to feel invisible. The prince's words made them feel valued again. Religious leaders across various faiths also embraced the story as an example of compassion in action. Sermons were preached about the importance of noticing suffering and taking action to help, with many citing the young prince as an example of putting faith into practice. The story reached social media influencers and celebrities, many of whom began sharing their own gestures of appreciation for service workers. This wasn't performed charity for cameras, but genuine recognition inspired by a child's authentic compassion. Perhaps most significantly, the story was changing conversations in families around dinner tables. Parents were using Prince George's example to teach their children about empathy, service, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity regardless of their job or position. But the most profound change was happening in the hearts of people who felt unseen in their own service roles. From hotel housekeepers to school custodians, from delivery drivers to care workers, people were finding renewed dignity in their work, because a young prince had reminded the world that every person who serves others deserves recognition and respect. The wave of positive change that Prince George had started with his simple, heartfelt words was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning to reach its full potential. 2 weeks after that transformative morning at Windsor Castle, the world had witnessed something remarkable. How one child's genuine act of compassion could create lasting change in countless lives. The story of Prince George and the Royal Guards had become more than just a news event. It had become a symbol of hope and human connection. Prince George himself seemed largely unaware of the global impact his words had created. To him, what he had done was simply the right thing to do. When his parents, Prince William and Princess Catherine, sat down with him to discuss the attention his gesture had received, he listened with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I just wanted them to know that someone noticed how hard they work," George explained to his parents. "Granny always says that we should take care of the people who take care of us." His simple explanation reminded his parents why they were so proud. of the young man he was becoming. The 4 guards had returned to their duties, but everything was different now. The new rotation system meant they were well-rested, alert, and genuinely happy to be at their posts. More importantly, they carried themselves with a renewed sense of dignity and purpose that was visible to everyone who encountered them. Thomas had been promoted to senior guard supervisor, a role that allowed him to ensure that the improved working conditions would be maintained and expanded to other royal residences. His first act in the new position was to implement regular check-ins with all guards about their physical and mental well-being. Marcus had become an unofficial spokesman for work-life balance among security personnel. He spoke at conferences about the importance of supporting family life for those in demanding service roles. His relationship with his daughter Emma had blossomed, and she proudly told her school friends that her daddy was a hero who protects the prince. David and Sarah renewed their wedding vows in a small ceremony attended by his fellow guards. The experience of nearly losing themselves to the demands of service had made them appreciate their relationship even more. David now served as a mentor to younger guards, helping them navigate the challenges of balancing duty and personal life. Samuel had become something of a celebrity among young people considering careers in public service. He received letters from teenagers around the world who had been inspired by his story to pursue careers in law enforcement, military service, and emergency response. He took this responsibility seriously, always emphasizing that service was both a privilege and a commitment. The changes at the royal residences had become a model for other institutions. Police departments, fire stations, and hospitals began implementing similar policies focused on worker welfare and recognition. The Prince George Protocol became an informal term for workplace policies that prioritized both duty and human dignity. In schools across the United Kingdom, teachers began incorporating the story into lessons about empathy, leadership, and social responsibility. Children wrote essays about times they had noticed someone who needed recognition or help, and many took action in their own communities. The international impact continued to grow. The story had been translated into dozens of languages and shared across cultures, resonating with people regardless of their background or political views. It had become a universal story about the power of kindness and the importance of seeing others as fellow human beings. Mental health organizations reported an increase in people seeking help, inspired by the conversations about burnout and exhaustion that the story had prompted. The stigma around admitting fatigue and seeking support had been reduced, partly because of the honest way the guards' struggles had been discussed at workplace wellness programs, flourished as employers realized that the simple act of recognition could improve both employee satisfaction and productivity. The phrase, "seeing your people," became common in human resources training, directly inspired by Prince George's example. A year later, the anniversary of the event was marked by the establishment of the Royal Recognition Award, given annually to individuals who demonstrate exceptional compassion for those who serve others. The first recipient was an 8-year-old girl who had organized her neighborhood to provide free meals for postal workers during the holiday season. The 4 guards remained close friends, their shared experience having bonded them in a way that went beyond their professional duties. They often reflected on how a child's simple act of kindness had not only changed their lives, but had rippled out to touch millions of others. Prince George, now a year older, continued to demonstrate the same compassion that had made him famous. He regularly checked on the guards, not as a royal duty but as a friend. His parents noticed that he had developed an even keener awareness of others' needs and a confidence in taking action when he saw something that needed to be addressed. The story had proven something beautiful about human nature, that kindness is contagious, that recognition matters, and that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest gestures. Prince George's gentle but meaningful act had indeed led the royal guard to step away, not from their duties, but from the isolation and exhaustion that had been consuming them. In stepping away from those negative patterns, they had stepped into a new way of serving that honored both their commitment to duty and their humanity. And in doing so, they had helped create a wave of positive change that continued to spread around the world, one act of recognition and kindness at a time. The young prince had learned an important lesson that day, too. That true leadership isn't about commanding others, but about seeing them, valuing them, and caring enough to act on their behalf. It was a lesson that would serve him well in the years to come. as he prepared for a lifetime of service to others.